Hey y'all, this is Miss O'Neill, and today we're going to do our unit on textiles and introduce the type of fiber arts that you have to see. So, the definition for textile art is a process of creating something using fibers gained from resources like plants, animals, insects, think like silkworms. And it's an extremely old art form that is kind of interpreted differently all over the world. So, all types of cultures have some sort of textile art, but it might look a little bit different. So there's a lot of different examples of this. For example, felting. Felting is when you're taking wool or synthetic wool and you use a specialist type of needle to compress it into different forms. So it's kind of like our paper project where we're taking something flat or like that little fiber kind of thing where it's very, very flat in 2D. And then as you compress it, you're adding the depth and the layering, and then it becomes something 3D. So all of these artworks here were actually created out of felt, including this cat, which is freaking terrifying. Another kind of textile or fibrous art is going to be known as sewing. So you might do this in one of your other classes, one of your FACS classes, but sewing is a thing that we use every single day or we have in all of our lives. As you can see, when you look at any of your clothing, you can see like the stitching is quite literally on it. So there's that way of interpreting it. But then there's also using it as an art form, whether that be like making specialized designs, like you'd see in a show like Project Runway, or using it for art, like we see like in kind of these upper examples as well. Or this is a national art project down at the bottom that is going to be a part of the like awareness of AIDS campaign. And then another thing, especially as it gets colder, this one we hold near and dear to our heart, which is our knitted and crocheted things. So there is a difference between the two of them, and this will be on the quiz. So please make sure you know it. The knitting is going to actually be where you're doing many open stitches at once, meaning you can incorporate lots of different colors into one design without having to close one individual stitch. So you usually end up with like a more colorful outcome if you're knitting. Whereas crocheting, you have to close one stitch before you move on to the other one. So usually with crocheting, if you have like one part of something, it's going to all be one color. And so like this hat is all one color. Each part of the skeleton is all one color. Each of these squares are all one color. So that's the difference between crocheting and knitting. But the one that we really want to focus on in this class is actually going to be weaving. Now, weaving, like I said for some of the other ones, is a very old art form and it is interpreted differently in every single culture. So we have some weavings that are going to be more flat, like a tapestry. We have other weavings that are going to be out of like strong, sturdy materials that you could actually use like for furniture. And then there's also like what's more probably the way you think about it, um, or the more common way to think about it, which is going to be basket weaving. So that's an example that we have down here. The main thing to highlight in all of the types of weaving that there are is that everything starts with warp and weft. So the warp strands are the strands that run up and down, and they are the ones that you are going to actually continue to have. They're like the structural parts. The warp is the structural parts. They're what you can allow you to make curves and all that jazz. And then the weft is the individual string or the yarn or whatever the material you're using to weave in between. So the warp is up and down, and the weft is in between. We do have two focus artworks or focus artists that we're going to be talking about today to kind of introduce our assignment and why we're doing our assignment the way we are. But I do, again, just want to say one last time that weaving can be found in every culture. And then also in every culture, there are going to be very similar vocabulary and tools used to do that. So weaving itself is the craft or action of forming fabric by interlacing threads. Typically, when we have our thread, we'll find it in something similar to this individual structure here, which is going to be where it's been spun into an individual thread. So if you have like any kind of anything that you sew with, like the threads in between your shirts or the yarn that we have, all of that's been spun to be a thread. Like the fibers weren't naturally that way, they had to be created that way. And then they're held on an actual structure that is called a bobbin. So when you hear us say, like, if you need to take something home, take a bobbin with you, that means make sure you have a structure to contain that spun yarn or thread. Again, the weft is going to be the things that weave in between, and the warp are the up and down pieces. And a loom is a structure that you can use. So as you can see, like up there in this top right-hand corner is an example of a loom. This is a actual kind of like machinery sort of thing that allows you to make tight weavings and help make sure that there's no gaps in your weavings. But the main thing to keep in mind is whenever you are using a loom, or if you are doing it by hand, is that the weaver always passes the weft through the spaces in between the warp. That's the main thing to gain from this. But now onto those contemporary artists that I promised that we'll get to. Those are going to be what's coming up next. Now, contemporary artist is a word that we might not have said particularly before. A contemporary artist is someone who is making art now, meaning within the past 100 years. In a lot of classes, you hear about like history of whatever subject it is, but it's important to keep in mind too that like with a lot of these art forms, no matter how long ago that they started, people are still doing them today. So that's where that contemporary comes in. And these in particular are using their identity to incorporate into their weavings. So let's see how that works. Wendigo is going to be our first artist. So this is him, and he uses weaving in kind of a unique way. So I want you to take a moment to look at this sculpture. This is a close-up of one of his sculpture. Now, what does that look like to y'all? That's actually going to be human hair. And I know that that's kind of like a whoa, frightening moment for a lot of people, but he has a good reason behind it. So when we're looking at this sculpture, just an example of how like you could do a formal analysis for him. I'm going to break down this. So we would typically do this in class, but since you're not here, we'll talk through it together. So we see that there's we know that there's hair in it, number one. So that's one thing. This is actually an installation because the whole room is set up to be part of the artwork, including the table and chairs, and it's all against the wall. So we know it's an installation. When we're thinking about other things we do see a table and chairs, and it looks like there's some kind of language on the individual pieces, the paneling of it. It's also all one color. So, well, two mainly, two colors, two neutrals. So that's another thing we could say. Moving on to analyze. So there's a unity in keeping it all the same color scheme. You can also say something along the lines of the lines going across the wall create movement across the wall. Being specific about where you find those things, all those would be good. You could also say there's a variety of texture in each of these artworks because of the hair. Okay, and then interpret. So that's where you get to talking about what you think this means. And when you look at this, you might not necessarily notice immediately, but what you would, if you were in there, you would see that there's words all over the wall, and some of them are supposed to look like they're either in another language or they're in English, but they don't actually spell anything. And the main part about this is supposed to kind of represent this idea of miscommunications between different like cultures and having issues communicating. But then the fact that it's made out of human hair is important. So this is where that hair comes in. The hair is supposed to be representative of the fact that we're all still woven together in this world. We, as a whole world, need to come together and like talk and be able to communicate in an efficient way, though that's not how it currently is right now. And that's what that table and chairs is there for as well. So being able to like sit down at the table with each other and like have communication. So he's weaving those experiences that he's had into his artwork. And then the last step of this would be to do that evaluation. So is this an effective artwork at conveying that? I think so. I would say that because you can, like, if you were there to experience all these things, that it would be very clear to you, and then you would continue to go down the list of the evaluation. To talk about where this identity comes in with the meaning of this, I just want to briefly tell you about his history. So Wendigo is originally from China. And when he was first born in China, there was no communication to any outside nation or anything like that. And then the US opened the door. So they had like the open door policy that opened up the opportunity for Wendigo to, for the very first time while he was in college, see artwork from places other than China, and he was inspired. He thought it was amazing. So what he did was he moved from China to the US to study in the US. And then he moved back. And that like sort of confusion, the miscommunication when he like moved there trying to learn like better English, and then when he moved back and he had forgotten some of his Chinese, it was very difficult for him, and it left him with a feeling of transnationalism. Transnationalism is a feeling where you feel like you identify with more than one culture of origin. Parts of him felt like he definitely belonged in the US, and then other parts of him felt like he definitely belonged in China. But there was no like one place where he felt 100% that he was from. And that feeling, that lack of communication that he was experiencing when he moved from place to place, is what contributed to his artwork. So his artwork, yes, it's about communication, but for the most part, it's really about that transnationalism that he experienced. So again, looking at it, you can see those words a little bit more clearly in this picture, and you can see how they don't necessarily really make actual words. So kind of like almost like a gibberish sort of deal, but weaving together this experience. So saying that like we're all here in the world together, we should make an effort to communicate and talk about these things that might divide us. And then the next artist. So this next artist we would typically introduce in a similar way, where we look at Bonnie Mitzler. Bonnie Mitzler is the artist that does this. For time's sake, I am not going to do the formal analysis on this, but I wanted to show you her artwork. Bonnie Mitzler really focuses on making sure that she is using recycled materials to do her artwork, and then by doing that, using recycled materials, she's also talking about her strong passion for the way in which we handle the world and the way in which that we don't really take care of what's natural around us. So, for example, like greenwashing, considering the way that we handle our coal. Also, all of these little black squiggly kind of things that are floating in the air are woven pieces of recycled metal that she has strung up to kind of represent the idea of like coal going into the air and polluting our air. Down here, you can see those are seashells, and these beads are kind of supposed to represent like the oil that's contaminating our seas. So our project is going to be taking these two ideas, I'm trying to find the best place for my picture, I'm so sorry. Taking these two ideas of incorporating your identity into a weaving. So by doing that, we're going to stick with Bonnie Mitzler's idea of using recycled materials, but we also are going to challenge you to think through what materials you can bring in that would best represent you as a person. So we do want this to be 95% recycled, which means that you'll have like a little bit of yarn you might be able to use, but the majority of it should be recycled materials, and you'll be responsible for bringing all those in. We have a couple things here and there, but definitely don't rely like on us to supply the entire thing. There's a large list of different kinds of materials that you can use, and they all turn out different. And that's the thing, they all look different in the end. So when we're looking at this one here, you can see like the paracord that's been woven in. That represents who he is as a person because he likes to rock climb. Over here, we've got this kind of like goofy, like monster sort of person. They like made the conscious effort to go out and buy yarn. Now, we don't really want you to have to buy anything for this assignment, but they wanted it to be this kind of like weird and wacky thing. And, you know, a weird and wacky person comes up with a weird and wacky sculpture, and that's incredible. The last one on the far left-hand side is going to be a sculpture from a student who was very like prim and proper. So they wanted this petite and little sculpture that had a nice big bow on it. So that was what they did there, is keeping that color scheme nice and prim and proper. I'm going to skip a couple slides to get to the very end to show you just this last little piece. So that is going to be a list of things that you might consider bringing in for your recycled materials. So we do expect you bring these in on Monday and Tuesday. So they can be like maybe an old t-shirt, but maybe that old t-shirt was like from an event that you really enjoyed going to, or it's like your favorite color or something like that. Plastic bags. Plastic bags make a really great recycled material. So any grocery bags you have, shopping bags, those are all good. Think about color scheme too. So like if you, for example, went to Ulta and you really like their color, you want to make sure you use that same color, you can. Wires and cords are good. So like if you have an old phone charger that doesn't work anymore, we don't want you to use anything that like you need back. But like one that doesn't work, usually you can find some of those. The inside of a clean chip bag, meaning you have to clean it before you bring it in. Plastic beaded necklaces are another really cool one. So those can be like, you know, like just the beads that you get from like a Party City, but they can also be like kind of the little things that you get when you're a kid, that, or like McDonald's little things. Those can work. Or VHS tapes turn out really cool. So like the tape that's actually inside of a VHS tape, which is like that old thing before we got DVDs, those are really cool. Magazine pages work nice, so you can turn those into little strips. And same thing for newsprint. So if you have a newspaper at home, newspaper can be a really interesting recycled material as well. But the options are very, very wide and open. If you have a cool idea for something that you would like to bring in instead and it's not on this list, definitely let one of us know and we'll tell you if it can work. There are a couple things here and there that might not work, but as long as you ask, then it'll probably be more than okay. So the next part of this assignment is just to fill out what you're going to bring in. And then, of course, on Monday and Tuesday, actually bring those things in, which you'll get points for as well. Thank you guys for finishing this video, and I hope you have a fantastic weekend.